So good afternoon, everyone. See some folks in the audience who I know, so I won't call on you. But again, as Karen said, it's a small group, so if we have any questions or you want to stop midway, shoot something in the chat. I'm not going to be watching the chat, but I think Emily will be. And they can just raise your hand, and ask me questions, or just open up the mic if something's not clear. Just a dialogue. Let's see if I can advance. So these are just some of the terms you'll hear me talk about during the presentation. So again, I'll read it real quickly. I might be talking about strategy. You can see the definition there. I might be talking about, I think I've lost the slide. I got to go back. I'm not going backwards. There. So before I start, I really want to give a quote out to a shout out to Albert Einstein, and I think this is apropos for this talk. And his quote was, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, but a single experiment can prove me wrong." And that's really the premise for killer experiments. And one of the things that I've seen with many companies that I've helped with over the years, and that's both small companies, startups, small companies, and even large companies that literally spend millions of dollars only to find out when they get close to market, they actually don't have a product. So they've wasted a tremendous amount of time, money, and effort all for naught. And they could have done some relatively simple and inexpensive studies earlier, experiments earlier, and found out that their idea just didn't have merit. Or more importantly, by asking those earlier questions and doing those earlier inexpensive studies, they might have uncovered unmet market need that they could easily pivot to. That's really the basis of the talk that I have here, which is you really want to, if you have an idea for a business, you really want to test your business ideas early. If it doesn't look like it's working out, kill it. Stop spending your money, or if you have investors' money, stop spending their money. Find something else to do, or perhaps you can find a place to pivot to, which is more exciting. So again, these are some of the terms you're going to hear. I'll say strategy, or it might be talk about business models. Killer questions and experiments. I'd like you all to think about it. You want to address the hardest questions that funders will be asking you. So if you're going to go out for investment, you have to think about what those investors are going to ask you. But even if you're in a large company, you have to ask yourselves, well, what will my management be asking me? I really want to address those questions up front and not wait until I'm much further down the road after I spent months and years trying to develop something and millions of dollars, only to find out it doesn't work. And all of this, again, has great benefit when you go to actually pitch, or you're trying to convince funders to support your opportunity, and that could be at a big company as well. If you can actually knock out some of these killer questions early, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, you can actually increase the valuation of your company, or increase the valuation of your product. And an MVP is just minimal viable product. So, this is true of me. It's true of everybody. Is typically your initial ideas are partially correct, and they're partially wrong. And you can see that the payout, in my mind, payout of most new ventures is bimodal. They're really significant if they succeed, and quite frankly, if you fail at what you're doing, other than the learning experience, there's quite frankly little value. So my belief is entrepreneurs, and this is not my belief, this has been taught by many other people, and I have references at the end, that your job is to identify potential deal killers or business killers earlier. So these are the variables that are likely to prove fatal to the venture. And the whole idea here is for you to design experiments as early as possible to remove risk. Those that have attended my other seminars, I generally talk about two types of risk: technical risk and commercial risk. So you really want to try and do the experiments early to really clearly demonstrate that your product or service has true differentiated value for your customer. You also perhaps want to do experiments to demonstrate that some other deep pocket rival doesn't have some valid underlying IP. So those are examples of what you can do. The longer you wait to actually do these critical experiments, the more time you're going to spend, the more money, and the more energy, and all that's at risk. And it also, I see a lot of companies not wanting to do these killer experiments early. And the longer you put them off, it actually increases your temptation to carry on no matter what you find when you actually do the experiments. So the whole idea here is to do these experiments early enough and frequent enough to help redirect your venture, and that could mean to stop it, and not to do studies, which I see so often, to confirm that your initial ideas were correct. Again, I see many companies I see many scientists do this, try and set up an experiment that actually proves your thoughts, your ideas, your hypotheses are correct, as opposed to the way I try to approach it and teach it. You should try and be breaking your ideas or trying to prove yourself that you're wrong. I'll talk about more of that in the future. And only if you can't convince yourself that you're wrong, do you actually increase the likelihood that what your ideas have some value. And again, successful experiments, or the results from successful experiments, can be incorporated into the pitch to investors, because in many cases it actually increases your valuation. So what are killer questions? It's a question meant to kill a project before significant resources are put into developing, perfecting the product or service. And it's important to remember there's more than one killer experiment. You actually should be doing killer experiments throughout your overall development efforts. In the drug world, one could think of the ultimate killer experiment are phase 1, phase 2, and ultimately phase 3 clinical trials. Again, many drug companies, and they do this successfully, they actually try and do much earlier studies before they get into these very expensive multi-million and sometimes billion-dollar clinical studies to find out that the product fails nonetheless. It's still a big issue in the pharma companies, and many drugs actually fail in late-stage clinical trials. So again, this applies to big businesses as well. No, and again, your experiments are really there to pressure test critical features, attributes, and requirements in as little time and as few resources as possible, quite frankly, as inexpensively as possible. I'm going to show you some examples later on that people should have done or could have done, and some that have done it successfully, whereas others, unfortunately, did not. And again, these could be in vitro studies. They could be in vivo, like for instance, in animal models. I'm talking about medical devices or drugs, or even potentially in humans. But it again applies to all kinds of businesses. It doesn't necessarily just apply to science. These can be economically focused or process oriented. And the most important to do, just like in any science experiment, you need to really well control your studies. And really think about how to do appropriate positive and negative controls. The whole idea is really to demonstrate during these studies that your idea is feasible, it's efficacious. Again, if we're talking about medical products, there's safety involved. There might be there's regulatory risks that you have to overcome. There's marketing risks, sales risk, IP risks. Again, all the various risks that you might face as you develop your product or your service. So as I mentioned before, you want to test early, frequently, and inexpensively. So again, this shows you, again, this is a simplistic model of the product development process. And again, I'll let you look at this slide. These are various phases. Again, there's lots of ways you could have drawn this slide. And really, I look at it, you should be doing killer experiments all along this process. The longer you go around the circle, as you go to counterclockwise, the more expensive the studies become. So again, I like to, as I counsel people, as I coach companies, try and identify the killer experiments early in the ideation and the product definition phase. And therefore, you can find out pretty quickly and pretty inexpensively whether your idea or your product or your service has any merit. I thought it'd be important to talk about what is not a killer question. So these are not, you're not trying to ask basic science. You're not trying to do exploration. You're not trying to establish a mechanism of action. You're not trying to ask something that doesn't have a clear endpoint. You really want to design a study that does have a very clear endpoint, so it doesn't leave you wondering later, now, did I design that quite right? Maybe I don't believe the results. You're trying to set up a study that gives you a clear answer. Hopefully, it'll continue to support that you move forward. But just as effective, if you do the experiment, and I've done some myself, that has told me the product's not going to fly. So stop it, and again, turn your resources and your effort onto something else. In the case of medical devices, it's typically not the definitive clinical study. And again, many companies wait to the definitive clinical studies. And I can give you some examples of that, some of the work that I'm doing with COVID. I won't tell a COVID story, but it won't be at the clinical studies stage, but it'll be close to that, where that's a very expensive place to find out that your product doesn't work. So how would you go about this? This is just a high-level view of how you can go about testing or doing killers. Is first of all, I like to think of every experiment by formulating hypotheses. And again, so I'm a scientist by training. So again, I approach these as forming, whether it's a marketing hypothesis, a pricing hypothesis, trying to identify what the opportunity is, what the resources are required, what the value are created. You can form hypotheses around these and many other things. And then if you go to the far right, you want to try and identify all the risks that your product, your service, or company might have. And again, this is a thought process, and you should be talking to other people and really identify what are the highest risk items in your overall product and overall strategy. These are some of the ones that I have listed: technology, customer demand, competitive response, pricing, could be intellectual property, could be go to market. These are not in any particular order. They could be in the order of your priority. But again, my recommendation is identify the highest risk items first. And that's what you want to test as soon as possible. Again, some companies test the easiest things first, so they get positive response and they feel like they can move forward, and they put the tough things off till the very end, only to again find out that their product or their services are going to be a failure. And the whole idea here is, again, if your experiment fails, make the hard decision to limit your investment, move on to something else. On the other hand, you want to, if you're successful, you should be actually moving to value inflection points in your product. Again, just I know I'm repeating myself, but again, I like to approach to really test your hypotheses. Actually, and so I have here, do a null hypothesis experiment. Try and prove that your hypothesis is wrong, as opposed to trying to prove your hypothesis is right. So you really need to do a lot of significant planning up front. I think you need to anticipate, based on your experimental design, how will the results inform you of the next steps? You can brainstorm this, you can actually model this, say, okay, I'm going to do this experiment based on these results, and you can simulate results. How will that help me decide whether I have something viable or not. And again, it's really important if you do these studies, again, you're spending your money, you're spending your investors' money. I advise you, please don't cheat. If you really have no intention on following through what the experiment tells you, then quite frankly, don't do the killer experiment. Or better yet, redesign it and make it more convincing. I mentioned this before around controls. I want to emphasize that you have to carefully select your controls. You want to do it so you can remove all doubt that you have a well-controlled experiment, that you have a definitive answer. A lot of times I recommend people read the literature, whether it be the scientific literature, the marketing literature, intellectual property literature. So reading patents are a great place to actually find out how people have done things similar to you in the past. You can also use it to identify competitive comparators. And a really good control is actually listening to your customer. And I'll talk more about that later. So I'm going to go through 5 examples. I picked 2 of these out of some of the literature that I read, which I have as references in the back. That's Netflix and medical tourism. The last 3 are from my own personal experience. These are companies that I've worked with. Some have been with the SBDC, some have been with some of the other work that I do. So I'm going to give you 3 companies. I'm not going to mention those due to confidentiality, but I'm going to talk in general about a liquid biopsy sample extraction kit company, a rapid COVID assay, and I've been working with a number of companies developing SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic products in the past year, as some of the other people on this call. And also a client from the SBDC who came up with the telemedicine idea. He actually presented in a seminar about a month or so ago, and I wanted to just, so if you saw that seminar, I'm going to repeat some of the things that he showed, but I thought he had a very successful killer experiment, which actually proved that his idea didn't work, and I want to take you through it and what he learned from that. And I thank him, and I'll mention him later. Thank him for some of his slides. So this goes a long time, so this is really dating me. It's dating the article I read. This is from the Harvard Business Review. This is early on Netflix. The CEO at the time, or the founder, Reed Hastings, came up with the idea. For those that are old enough, perhaps like me, remember that in order to watch a DVD, we actually had to go to a store like Blockbuster Video and where I lived, Mr. Movies, and we had to actually rent a DVD, take it home. And his original idea, and now you can see how much Netflix has evolved from there, is that why should you have to go to a store? Why don't I just kind of follow the Amazon model? You can order online and I'll mail you a DVD. So the first thing that he really had to figure out is to test it, is that really an efficient way to distribute movies? So he simply did a very simple experiment. He took a CD, he put it in an envelope, and he mailed it to himself. And when he found out that he was successful in mailing it to himself, the movie arrived in 24 hours. Of course, he's not using today's U.S. Postal Service, but perhaps it'd probably be a good idea to do it that way. And again, it really confirmed very quickly that one of the basic operational tenets of his business model is that you can mail CDs or DVDs through the mail. They get through efficiently. They get through undamaged. And quite frankly, at the time, I forgot what the article said. It only cost them 24 cents. I guess mail has gone up a little bit by that, but it's still quickly confirmed that this is not going to be a deal killer or a critical flaw in his thinking. Another example from another article that I read that's referenced in the back is around medical tourism. This company actually had an idea, and again, you might have seen these, then these businesses do exist today. The whole idea was it's really expensive to do medical care in the United States. So why not fly patients overseas, high quality, inexpensive medical care, such that it's even at half the cost of the same care in the United States. This particular company raised a lot of money. They spent quite a bit of it conducting a series of interviews with Fortune 500 companies, talking to corporate benefits managers and insurers around the country. They walked away with a very promising result. But then they actually got smart and they decided to test with 2 quick and easy voice of customer surveys. They actually, in 2 weeks, held a focus group and introduced the concept to the people that were going to actually be paying for the service, prospective patients. They also called U.S. hospitals around the country and asked them, what happens if we pay for, how much does it cost to pay for a particular medical procedure up front? So what are your unpublished discount prices for certain procedures? By the way, you can do that now, even if you have insurance. You can call up the company and ask them how much an MRI will cost if you pay them up front in cash. You're going to find that their unpublished rates are quite a lot less than what they charge insurance companies. Anyway, what this company found is that, first of all, patients on these focus groups said they weren't really interested in the whole business idea. And secondly, they also found that U.S. hospitals would lower their prices to near the international levels if patients paid cash up front. So in those 14 days, that's 6 months after they started this company and spent a lot of money, they actually found out that their business model was not viable. They actually pivoted because they were talking about flying people to Europe and to Asia, and they pivoted and said, why don't we just fly them to Canada or Mexico? Where they found it to be a lot better business model. So that's just another quick example of killer experiments. I'm going to go through a couple examples in my own experience. So this is a liquid biopsy sample extraction company. This company had the hypothesis that if one samples a large volume of blood or urine, it'll increase the sensitivity of next generation sequencing for detecting minimal residual disease in cancer. So again, patients that have cancer and they're under treatment, the disease gets knocked down, and the mutations are in very low amounts in liquid biopsy, that's in blood or in urine. Therefore, if you try and do next generation sequencing, you can't detect targets that aren't there. So this company made a hypothesis, why not just sample a much larger volume? If you can have a technology that can have a much larger volume, you can actually isolate more targets, and it can improve the performance of next generation sequencing. I was doing some work with them at the time. We identified the following 5 key risks. First of all, could we actually do it? Could the company develop the technology to actually process large volumes of blood or urine? In the case of urine, we're talking about 50 cc's or 50 mLs. It's quite a lot of fluid to extract DNA from. We identify whether clinicians would even accept it, because everybody's used to taking as little blood or as little biological samples as possible out of a person. Other key risk is, well, there's some really big behemoth competitors in the market. Again, 2 of the biggest ones are Thermo Fisher and Creager. We thought pricing would be a key risk. So even if they could do this, what would the product have to be priced at? And ultimately, would customers even accept it? And so numbers 2 and number 5 are related. The customers are actually the laboratories, but they actually have to sell their products to the clinicians. So we had to test both of those customer segments. And that's what we did. So before this company even got started, I convinced them to do voice of customer studies. And they did 2 studies. This was over about, these are 2 studies that went in succession, so they weren't done at the same time. So it's about 16 weeks. They were very intensive studies where they were talking to at least 50 customers and 50 clinicians. from the customers. They got a really valuable feedback. The customers did perceive a lot of value. What they also told them, in order if they were going to buy this product, the product had to have certain features to it. It also came back that this market is highly price sensitive. So those are really valuable lessons that helped them drive their development effort. They also got a lot of great feedback from clinicians who, by their very nature, are ultra conservative, and the overall response was neutral. Clinicians wouldn't commit until they actually saw real clinical evidence that this actually works. So that again informed the company that in order to do that, now you're talking about finishing the development of the product and doing clinical studies. So they would have a really good idea of how much capital they would have to raise to actually prove that this was a clinically viable product. Then lastly, they decided to do a really intense analysis against the leading competitors. So they did have to develop a minimally viable product. So now we're talking about spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, but still not millions. And they actually went head to head against those competitors with their MVP at customer labs. Very successful outcomes. Again, they were able to take that to investors and were able to raise quite a bit of money based on that. So the take home from this particular lesson was, by doing these successful killer experiments, again, the highest risk that identified was customer acceptance, market acceptance. They were able to overall decrease their business risk. They conserved cash early on, and then put off the really expensive studies until they confirmed that there was a market need. And then they ultimately increased their valuation. Now I'm going to go to some more recent work that I've been doing with COVID. So just as a way of disclosure, I'm actually working with NIH on the RADIX program. I actually have spoken about this in the past year. And we're helping companies rapidly develop over-the-counter home test and a point-of-care test for detecting SARS-CoV-2. And just as a plug, some of our products you're seeing in the news, some of the companies we're working with are successfully launching diagnostic tests right now. But one of the companies that I had a chance at working with came at this, in my opinion, the wrong way. They actually had an idea. They wanted to jump in on the action. They thought there would be a tremendous market need, and by the way, there is. So immediately they acquired intellectual property from another company that they thought would increase the performance of their product and give them a distinct competitive advantage. They actually entered into a merger agreement with the other company. I'm not going to, I know what they paid. I can't disclose that. They hired a large group of people. So they had over 50 people now working on this product. I think at one time they had 103 people working on this product. They also already were planning on scaling up, and they purchased already over $1 million in manufacturing equipment. What they never determined up front was, does the technology actually work? They didn't find that out until we actually started doing clinical studies. So this is a study that's done for infectious disease, limited detection. How sensitive is the product? So they did an analytical performance study at a customer site, and the product actually failed to perform. It was horrible. They actually went back to the drawing board. They tried to redevelop the product over the next couple of weeks. They spent a lot more money, and the product failed again. That company ultimately disbanded. They broke up the merger agreement. They laid off all the people. That, of course, cost a lot more money. And the take home from this is, if they would have done a simple study upfront with the intellectual property, probably in a couple of weeks, they could have saved their investors quite a bit of money, and they could have saved quite a bit of time and effort on their part. And then my last example is I'm working with an entrepreneur, Brian Cohn, who actually did this work. And he had an idea based on some work that he did for his PhD work at USC that he could use virtual reality to actually set up a telemedicine company for occupational therapists. So he thought his timing was perfect. He set out, hey, the COVID pandemic is here. That's going to increase the demand for telemedicine. People aren't going to go for occupational therapy. He also thought virtual reality was a really cool technology. It would make it fun for the patients. And again, he had ways of collecting a lot of data from these systems that would provide that data back to the clinicians, and that it would tell the clinicians how well the patients were recovering from their issues. And he was primarily working with patients who underwent upper extremity surgeries or upper extremity injuries, such as rotator cuff surgery or shoulder repairs. So again, this is one of his slides where he showed that based on his data, he could collect a lot of information about rotation of movement around the shoulder, how high people could raise their arm after shoulder surgery. I've had shoulder surgery, so I really related to this because it took me close to 9 months to get my arm back to 100, no, straight up over my head. So again, I could relate to that, so it made sense to me. But again, he had already developed some pretty quick prototypes and started to develop the product. At this point, I got involved and I asked him to please slow down on the development because I wanted him to test the key hypothesis. Does the market want this product? It's just a little joke on my part, talk to customers. What do customers have to do with products they eventually want to buy? So I asked him again to stop working on the development of the effort and go talk to customers. So he was a pretty innovative fellow, and even that takes a little bit of money. So he actually reached out to Microsoft. He reached out to the USC Marshall School of Business. He got a little bit of funding. And he got some headsets from Microsoft where he actually could do some pretty inexpensive and rapid voice of customer studies. This is one of the things that he and I talked about is, we talked about customer segments and we identified a number of segments that he should be talking to. So he went out and talked to skilled nursing facility folks, occupational therapists. He went to rehab centers. This is all virtual, by the way. Directors of rehab. He talked to hospital administrators, and he talked to physical therapists. What he ultimately found is that because he was trying to, his whole business model is this would really work well in groups. Because one therapist could be having multiple Zoom calls with groups virtually. And what he found out that the standard of care, and that includes reimbursement, was not aligned for group care. He did find out that the current standard of care that's out there, there's not a lot of good standard of care for working on upper body issues. But he also identified that the standard of care also required constant monitoring. So those are all good things that he identified that his product could solve. But he also found out, more importantly, from these different customer segments, that group care did not really deliver the savings and the profits back to these various settings. And then most importantly, he found out that each patient has different requirements, which makes a group care approach not viable. So at the end of the day, and he did this study over about 3 months. Again, it was a lot harder with COVID because he couldn't just go and talk to people and visit people. He realized that he wasn't going to move forward to it. He actually found out something pretty interesting during this whole process. he actually found out that he ended up talking to a number of speech pathologists during this voice of customer work. And he found out that speech pathology, on the other hand, was very amenable to telemedicine or virtual reality, not using these glasses, but using the basic technology that he had behind the VR glasses. He could actually apply to speech pathology. He found out there was a real need for speech pathology, including lessons over Zoom or other types of virtual sessions. And he pivoted his entire company, is now focusing on that, and has actually already successfully raised some capital. So in summary, successful killer experiments remove risk and leave no doubt that the product is an improvement over the status quo. It's really important that whatever model you use for killer questions, they have to be meaningful to the people who work in the area. So if you're going to do a killer experiments like Brian did, he really has to do it in such a way that he's testing it with the users for his products and services. And my last comment, which is really important one, a lot of entrepreneurs have a hard time accepting this. If your killer experiment shows that your product isn't viable, a definitive kill it decision is a major success. And that also goes for large companies. I've been in large companies where it was very hard to kill a project. I found out the hard way that the sooner I could kill a project, the sooner we could actually move on to more productive ideas that have a better return for the company. With that, I'll pause and take questions. Again, these are some references. This deck will be available to you, and you can actually check these references out as well. So, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Richard, for this wonderful presentation. If anybody has any questions, now's the time to ask them. Feel free to hop on the video and then ask your questions.
Yes, I've got a few. This is Stan.
Okay, go ahead, Stan. Nelson, you can go after Stan.
Well, I think, number one, many customers don't have any damned idea what they want or need. And so I always feel like when we go ask objective questions, we have to keep in mind that the more disruptive a technology, the more important it is to understand that customers can't necessarily visualize a new product or idea, and will frequently give you exactly the wrong information about whether something is viable or not. I think what we have to do is really be careful and ask medical questions to medical doctors and not marketing questions.
Oh, absolutely, Stan. Again, I didn't go into the details about how to ask what kind of questions that you should ask. Again, what many companies do is that they might go in and talk about their product, and that's not the approach I would even use. Again, I would go in really.
Okay.
I agree with you 100%. Is really trying to understand, in the case of a medical product, talking to physicians about the products that they're using, what's working about it, what's not working about it, really probing it. And if they start to discuss what's not working about it, and if you ask them, I ask them a lot of time, if you could describe a product that would really solve this patient's need, what would it be? And based on the answer they give that, if that lines up to my product idea, I'm not talking about my product idea. If that lines up to my product idea, I know I have something viable.
And does the guy down the street have this problem? Not that the doctor we're talking to ever has the problem, because they never have problems. They have perfect outcomes. And so, I mean, those are actually important things to learn over time, is how to ask these questions so that you actually get the right kind of feedback. The second thing I was going to mention is that in early stage, specifically in medical devices, you can go down a very wrong path in early validations like in animals, right? We always experiment on young, healthy animals that have none of the anatomy pathology of the human condition we're trying to treat. And so you can get exactly the wrong answer from those. So we have to be careful that we don't kill viable projects through a lack of understanding of the differences between early animal validations and the requirements of humans with different anatomy and pathology.
No, again, 100% agree with you. Again, I don't have the same experience you have in implantables, in vivo devices, but I have in vitro devices, and I'll take even a lot of the work I've been doing with COVID. A lot of the companies are testing their products in models, and the models tell them that their product or work, and I say, wait a minute, you got to test your product on sick. These people are sick, and the physiology of whether it be a nasal secretion or the physiology of what's going on in somebody's mouth of a person suffering from COVID is completely different than a healthy person.
Right.
Again, those are, so we spend a lot of time, and I've spent a lot of time with these companies. How do we design experiments to test in that model?
Right.
Versus testing in a healthy model. I agree with you 100%. That's why I think it takes a lot of time to really think about the experiment you're going to do.
Yeah, so the last comment is that, we fundamentally have two questions typically, and that is, does it work? And then secondly, does it work well enough? Well enough to be paid for, well enough to be competitive, well enough to be sustainable, all those things. And the first one is typically a little easier to answer than the second, right? Because we have to go through a process to get to the point where we say, is it good enough to perform, to launch, to freeze the design and take into further development? And that one's harder, especially before we get into first in man. But I absolutely agree with you. We need to answer it as early as possible, typically with pilot studies, but it is a more challenging one for all of us.
Absolutely, which is why, if I brush through it, I recommend we got to do these experiments all along the continuum of product development. Now, again, in the case of a lot of medical devices, in case of drugs, you ultimately have to do it. You ultimately have to get it into humans. You have to get it in first in man. But again, if you can design those even the early pilot studies, not the pivotal studies,
right,
where you're spending, maybe millions of dollars as opposed to tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah. So
the same principles apply.
I'm totally with you on the concept of ask the tough questions first and answer them first, not the easy ones. Go after the tough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Good
Yeah,
questions.
Thank you, Richard.
Next day.
Go ahead,
Somebody else have a
Nelson.
question?
Okay, hi. Thanks. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, fantastic presentation. I think why I was sort of so intrigued by it is it almost does something quite obvious, but it's not something that I look at the sort of normal engineering process and the heavily gated review and design review and that sort of evolution. But I think this one is a bit more, it pokes at the core of the technology. So I thought that was, it seems obvious, but it's kind of not. And I agree. When I reflect in my business, we don't do enough of that. But specifically, I guess my side of the question is, you say you do the killer experiment, you get a result, and I think in an ideal world, it's very black and white, but typically it's not. Typically, in engineers and scientists, you're going to go, well, hold on, it's just I didn't do this, or we can tweak it, we can push on, right? And it's very fair enough for the person directly related. It's very hard for them to let go. But if there is even a trail of evidence that this might work, he will just kind of linger on. So I guess my specific question is, what is that, or can you talk more to the mechanism itself that will just go based on this metric? You can't go and invest another 10K, another 100K. You just can't, is there something that can give you that sort of answer?
So again, I gave you some examples, which I might have given everybody so oversimplified. It might be not a single killer experiment, but as scientists and engineers, generally speaking, after 2 or 3 or 4 experiments, if you start to get indications that you start to get hints that this is not quite working, and you have to make a determination at that point whether I can pivot. So there's a different, I'm seeing some other thing that hint that there's a different approach, and I'm not going to pivot into technology. Or wait a minute, this bird's not going to fly, and I got to stop. So that's the hard part. That's the early part, which is very hard for most of us, is to recognize that my baby isn't going to fly. I won't say my baby's ugly, but I just said. So it is a hard question. So most people convince themselves, oh, I didn't set the experiment up right, and they keep dragging on. But Nelson, you have to ask yourself the question, because after 4 or 5 months, you're getting the same feedback that this is a lot harder than I thought. This isn't working. You might want to start listening to the data. I say this to a lot of people I work with. I always get this visual that my data is touching me on my shoulder, saying, "Hey, listen to me, look at me. Something's not right." And if I ignore it, and if I ignore it too long, somebody's going to pick up a 2x4 and hit me in the forehead. And I think what a lot of companies realize is when they actually start to go out and try and raise money, and they're totally unsuccessful raising money, they're now getting hit by the 2x4.
Yep.
And I still see people, oh yeah, but I got to keep going. I got to keep going. I got to keep going. As opposed to, hey, you got a lot of these entrepreneurs are really smart. Come up with another idea, pivot. But I understand what you're saying, and the challenge, as Stan said, is you got to design the right experiment. It's not easy to do that.
That's right.
Yeah. I had another example. Company I was working with, again, antibiotic susceptibility. They showed me this great technology, and Stan's question, I said, yeah, but does it work? And they told me all the other things, and I said, how sensitive, how many bacteria can you detect in 5 mLs of blood? I said, just do that experiment. I could design it. We could do that experiment in 1 week. They put that experiment off for 3 to 4 months. They finally did it. Instead of they had to detect down to, let's say, 5. Their limit of sensitivity was 500,000. Now that experiment, there were 5 orders of magnitude away from where they had to be. No amount of engineering was going to fix that. So yeah, I understand it's tough, but yeah. We have a few more minutes. Anybody else?
Chaz, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes, great talk, thank you. So I am a very, very young graduate student, and I'm in the ideation phase, right? And I'm this kind of experimental stage is kind of early for me, but I wanted to hear this talk, and I'm so glad I did. But now then my question is there a resource where someone who's trying to begin designing these experiments can like consult with somebody to help point out, hey, you need to make sure you have this experiment and this experiment to have a complete killer experiment sort of plan? Because you can fumble around for a year and you're thinking you're doing these killer experiments, but you're still like, it's really not. You kind of need that person with experience to be like, no, you're really missing this or missing that.
So if you're a graduate student, I'm hoping you can use your mentor for that.
I'm
Uh,
I'm in an unfortunate COVID kind of kicked me around. So this idea, while I was being kicked around, kind of came little ideas from different places. So I'm kind of in an independent space. So I don't have that direct mentor, unfortunately, yet.
Yeah, so normally, I mean, that's what the SBDC is, but I think you're a little early for us.
Right, of course.
Um, So I'd have to think about that. I don't know if anybody else on the phone has an idea on the call. That's where Jazz can get some help. It's a good question.
It's okay, thank you.
Yeah,
This
I don't
presentation,
have an answer. I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. I just thought to hop on and see what I can learn, but it was it did give me a lot of things to think about. So thank you.
Great.